The wheelchair hit the corridor wall with a sound like a gunshot. Emily didn't flinch. She sat in it, 7 months along, hospital gown still tied at the back, bare feet finding the cold linoleum floor before the chair had even stopped moving, and she looked up at Kevin with the particular stillness of someone who had already survived the worst thing. Not composure, not strength, something older than both. The nurses at the station had gone rigid. A man in a waiting chair across the hall looked up from the paper in his hands. Kevin was still talking. His voice filled the corridor the way smoke fills a room. Slow then everywhere at once. "You did this on purpose," he said. "Both of you. This whole thing was designed to trap me." Emily looked at her hands, then at him. "You should leave," she said quietly, "before someone sees you." 3 nurses exchanged a glance. Nobody moved. And from across the hall, a man in a plain gray jacket folded his newspaper very carefully and did not look away. "If you're already leaning forward, you might want to like and subscribe before we go any further, because what happens next is the part nobody talks about." 3 weeks before the wheelchair, Emily had been happy. That was the part nobody warned you about. Not the ending itself, but the distance between the last good moment and the first bad one. How thin that border was. How you could be standing on one side of it, laughing in a kitchen, while your boyfriend burned toast and pretended he hadn't, and then 2 weeks later be sitting alone in a hospital bed, counting the tiles on the ceiling because there was nothing else to count. Her name was Emily Johnson, 26. Born in Lagos to a mother who believed in warm food and cold honesty, raised in London from the age of 9, currently making her life in Seoul because that was where the work was and because Seoul, with its sharp air and its neon and its particular loneliness, felt like the kind of city that would leave you alone enough to become yourself. She had met Kevin Adeyemi at a charity dinner 3 years ago. He was charming in the specific way that men who have practiced being charming always are, effortless on the surface, with the effort visible only in retrospect. He brought flowers he hadn't chosen himself. He remembered details she'd mentioned once. He made her laugh, and she had been lonely enough, and cautious enough, and young enough to mistake the relief of being seen for something more durable. For 2 years it had been fine, not perfect. Fine. He worked in finance, mid-level, ambitious in the horizontal way, always moving sideways rather than up, always about to make a move that would change everything. She worked in event logistics, which meant she was good at managing chaos and better at hiding it, and she paid more than half the rent without making it a conversation, because she had grown up watching her mother pay every bill without flinching, and she had inherited both the habit and the damage it did. The pregnancy had not been planned, but she had been happy. She had held the test in her hands in the bathroom of their apartment, sitting on the edge of the tub in the early quiet of a Tuesday morning, and she had felt something open inside her chest that had been closed for years. She was 26. She was not afraid. She had looked at herself in the mirror and said quietly, like a promise, "We can do this." She had been wrong about Kevin, not immediately. At first he was present in the ways she needed. He sat with her through the first nausea. He came to the 6-week scan. He held her hand in the waiting room with the focused attention of someone performing a role they'd studied. But then his firm restructured. His position was eliminated. The word eliminated was the one he used 3 times in the same conversation, as if repetition could make it sound less like failure. And the woman had appeared. Her name was Sue-Ah Park, or more precisely, she was the daughter of Councilman Park Jae-won, whose photograph appeared regularly in the kind of newspapers that Emily didn't read, but that Kevin had recently taken to leaving open on the kitchen table. She was 23. She was beautiful in the precise, curated way of someone who had grown up with enough money to make beauty a project rather than an accident. And Kevin had met her at a networking event he'd attended without telling Emily, and he had come home that night quieter than usual. And Emily, who understood silences the way some people understood weather, had felt the shift without being able to name it. The cruelty came in slowly, not all at once. First the distance, the way he stopped reaching for her in sleep, the way his eyes went somewhere else in the middle of conversations. Then the criticism, always precise, always deniable. Her clothes were wrong for Seoul's professional climate. Her laugh was too loud for the spaces he was now trying to occupy. Her pregnancy made certain people uncomfortable, and he needed those people. Then, one night after she had mentioned the baby shower her colleague Marcus was trying to organize, Kevin had looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "You know this isn't what I planned." "None of this is what I planned," she had not replied. She had carried his plate to the sink and washed it, and she had stood at the window and looked at the street 4 floors below, and she had made the private decision that she would not beg him to stay. She had made that decision with the same quiet authority with which she made all her important decisions, alone at a window, without witnesses, but she hadn't left. Because she was 7 months pregnant, 3,000 miles from her mother, and the loneliness of soul had grown fangs. The collapse happened on a Tuesday evening, the same weekday on which everything important in her life had apparently decided to occur. She had been carrying boxes from the second bedroom, clearing space for the nursery she was building alone because Evan had said he would help, and then found other things to do, and the combination of the weight and the heat and the fact that she hadn't eaten since 10 in the morning had converged into something her body refused to continue ignoring, and she had gone down hard, on her hands and knees first and then sideways, and the pain in her side was the kind that made thinking briefly impossible. Kevin had driven her to the hospital. She had held onto the door handle the entire way, not because she was afraid, but because her hands needed something to grip. At the admissions desk, he had given her name and her condition and his insurance information, and she had watched him do all of this correctly and thought, he is performing care very well. They had put her in a room. They had run tests. The baby was fine. The doctor had said this twice, and both times Emily had let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Just stress and dehydration and a minor muscle strain, rest, fluids, monitoring overnight. Kevin had gone to the corridor to make a call. He had been gone 40 minutes. When he came back, his face was different, not worried, resolved. He stood in the doorway of her room with his jacket folded over his arm. His jacket, not hers. And she noticed this, and he said, Sua's father called. There's a dinner. It's important. A pause. I have to go. She had looked at him. I'm in the hospital. You're stable. The doctor said you're stable. You don't need me here. Kevin, Emily. His voice had gone flat. I've been here for 3 months carrying this situation. I need you to understand how that feels. She had understood many things in that moment. She had understood that he had just called her pregnancy this situation. She had understood that carrying was a word he had chosen deliberately in a hospital where she was the one who had been actually carrying something. She had understood that the man standing in her doorway had decided, somewhere in the last 40 minutes, that she was a problem he was finished with. She said nothing. She had learned that silence deployed correctly was the most powerful thing a person could do in a room, but Kevin had mistaken her silence for permission. That was his oldest habit. He had walked to her bed. He'd spoken quietly, almost gently, the way people speak when they're about to say something they want to be able to deny later. When you get out of here, he said, I think you should go back to London. Take the baby. Start over. I'll send money for the first year. I'm not a monster, but this thing between us is finished. It was finished before this. Emily had looked at him for a long time, not at his face. Past it. Okay, she said. He had not expected okay. He had expected tears or argument or the kind of scene that would give him the role of reasonable man against an unreasonable woman. He stood there for a moment with nothing to push against. Then he turned and walked out. And he had walked out of her room and into the corridor and down the hall to where 2 nurses were chatting at a station, and he had stopped, apparently deciding, in the way that people who have not yet fully humiliated someone often do, that the job was incomplete, and he had turned back, and his voice had lifted to the volume of someone who wanted an audience. She trapped me, he said, to the nurses, to the corridor, to anyone listening. This whole pregnancy, this whole collapse tonight, she planned it. Women like her, they find a man who's going somewhere, and they make sure he can't leave. And I'm not doing it anymore. I'm done. The nurses had gone very still. If she's got no one, that's not my problem, he continued, louder now, gathering himself in the way of someone who has mistaken cruelty for honesty. She came to this country alone, and she's going back to it alone. That baby isn't going to change what I have to do with my life. And then he had gone back to her room, not to apologize, but to find her wheelchair and push it, with her still in it, into the corridor. The wheelchair hit the corridor wall with a sound like a gunshot, and Emily sat in it, bare feet on the cold floor, and looked up at Kevin with the stillness of someone who had already decided she would not give him the scene he came back for. The man across the hall had not moved. He was watching with the careful, total attention of someone who had been watching for a very long time and who had just seen something he was not going to unsee. His name was Kang Min-ho, and he had been sitting in that corridor for 4 hours, not because he was a patient, not because anyone in his family was ill. He was there because Emily Johnson was there, and wherever Emily Johnson was, Min-ho was somewhere nearby, not close enough to be seen, not close enough to be needed, but present in the way that a shadow is present, attached to the source of light, invisible until you know what to look for. He was 34 years old. He was dressed in a plain gray jacket over a dark shirt, no watch, no visible jewelry, hair slightly grown out from whatever cut it usually kept. He looked like a graduate student, a quiet academic, the kind of man you'd sit next to on a train without thinking about him for the rest of the day. That was an extraordinary amount of effort for a man who commanded the most significant organized network across 3 countries. He watched Kevin's performance with the expression of someone solving a very simple arithmetic problem. His eyes moved from Kevin to Emily to the nurses to the exit and back to Emily, and in the space of about 30 seconds he had cataloged everything he needed to know. The nurses were witnesses but not interveners. Kevin was performing for an audience rather than genuinely threatening. Emily was not in immediate physical danger, and Emily was not going to cry. That last part he had known. He had watched Emily for 8 months, and she had not cried once in a space where anyone could see her. It was the thing about her that had undone him first. The story of how they had become, technically legally, married was not a romantic one. It was a story that belonged to a rainy night in Lagos 11 months ago, during a period when Minho had been operating in West Africa for reasons he did not discuss with anyone who did not already know, and when a combination of bad intelligence and worse timing had put him in a situation that required, urgently, a civilian who spoke English and Yoruba and who appeared to the wrong people to be his wife. Emily had been at the wrong hotel at the right moment. She had translated 3 sentences under significant pressure, kept her face entirely neutral while doing it, and when it was over she had looked at him and said, "You owe me for that," and he had, involuntarily, unhelpfully, almost smiled. The marriage that followed was administrative, a protective fiction. Her name in certain records, connected to his, in a way that would make her untouchable to the people who had been watching him. He had explained this to her clearly. She had asked 4 practical questions, all the right ones, and signed the papers. He had not expected to think about her again. He had thought about her every day for 11 months. It started as surveillance, legitimate, justified by the fact that her connection to him made her a potential target, and he was obligated to ensure she wasn't harmed by his associations. He had people watching, nothing obtrusive, status updates twice a week. She was fine. She moved through Seoul with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste motion. She worked. She cooked. She called her mother on Sundays, and in those calls she spoke Yoruba and laughed differently than she laughed in English. Freer somehow, younger. And he knew this because his surveillance was thorough, and he should have stopped listening, and he did not stop listening. Then the pregnancy, and the change in Kevin, and the night she had stood at her kitchen window for 17 minutes without moving, and Minho, reading the report the next morning, had felt something inside him that he had no useful vocabulary for, and that he chose not to name. He had come to the hospital himself tonight because 2 of his people had reported the collapse, and he had read the message 3 times before closing his laptop and getting in the car. He was not going to intervene. He was going to observe. He was going to confirm she was receiving care and leave. That had been the plan. He stood. He crossed the corridor, not quickly. He moved the way he always moved in neutral spaces, with the kind of unhurried certainty that clears a path without requiring it, and people stepped aside for him without knowing why. He stopped in front of Emily. She looked up at him. Across the 8 months of distance and surveillance and the 11 months before that, this was the first time they had been face to face since Lagos. He watched her recognize him, the slight widening of her eyes, the stillness that replaced whatever expression had been forming, and he watched her decide in about 2 seconds how to respond to this. "Minho," she said, "not what are you doing here, not how did you know, just his name, stated like a fact she was filing correctly. You should be in your room," he said. "I'm aware." The nurse looked between them. Are you family?" "Yes," Minho said. Emily said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She let the nurse guide her back down the corridor, and Minho walked beside her, not holding her arm, not touching her, 2 feet of space maintained between them, and when they reached her room and the nurse stepped outside to get fresh water, Emily sat on the edge of her bed and looked at him standing in the doorway and said, 8 months, yes. You've been watching, yes. Why are you here now?" "He's gone, I'm fine." Minho looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the wall. A specific habit of his, looking away when the thing he wanted to say was something he hadn't decided how to say yet. "Because you shouldn't be alone tonight," he said. It was not the answer she expected. She had expected something operational. A mention of exposure, of security risk, of the administrative logistics of their paper marriage becoming complicated by the evening's public scene. She had not expected something that sounded, if she let herself hear it plainly, like care. She did not let herself hear it plainly. "You can go," she said. "I'll manage." He sat down in the chair beside the door. He did not respond. He simply sat, in the plain gray jacket, with his hands on his knees and looked at the middle distance. Emily lay back against the pillows. The monitor beeped steadily. Her baby moved, a small rolling pressure in her side, and she pressed her hand there without thinking. Minho was looking at her hand, then he looked away. She fell asleep before she meant to, and when she woke at 3 in the morning, the chair was empty, and there was a single warm cup of tea on the bedside table that had not been there before, and a blanket over her feet that the hospital blanket had not been covering. She lay still in the dark for a long time, listening to the building breathe, and she did not let herself think about who had left those things. But her hand stayed on her side, where the baby was still, and she thought, "We are not as alone as I thought." Kevin's world began to come apart on Thursday. He did not connect it to Wednesday's hospital corridor because he was not the kind of man who made connections between his actions and their consequences. He was the kind of man who experienced consequences as random weather, inexplicable and unfair, bearing no relation to anything he had chosen. The first thing was the investment firm. He had been in late-stage conversations with a mid-sized soul operation, the kind of position that would have reset his trajectory, the sort of opportunity that required the right name attached to the right recommendation at the right moment. On Thursday morning, he received a call from their HR director explaining that the position had been filled internally, politely, thoroughly. He called 2 contacts to follow up. Neither returned the call. On Friday, the apartment he had been negotiating to sublease, closer to Sue A's family neighborhood, which he had not mentioned to Emily and had not needed to, fell through. The landlord apologized. The language was careful. There was no good reason given. By the following Monday, Sue A had stopped answering his messages. He sat in the apartment he shared with Emily, who was not there, who had been discharged from the hospital to somewhere he didn't know because he hadn't asked. And he scrolled through his contacts and made 6 calls, and in each one there was a subtle wrongness, a slight cooling in voices that had been warm, a brief hesitation before his name was acknowledged. He could not locate the source of it. He would not locate it. That was by design. 2 floors below Emily's hospital room in the car park at 11:15 on Wednesday night, Minho had made 4 phone calls. The calls were brief. The instructions were specific. His voice had been exactly as calm as it always was, which was the most frightening thing about it. He did not use words like destroy or punish. He did not need to. The people he spoke to understood the architecture of what was being asked without requiring the ugliness of having it stated. Kevin Adeyemi's professional network in Seoul was not large. The people who controlled access to it were known quantities. A word here, a withdrawal there, not violence, not even illegality, just the quiet rerouting of opportunity away from a specific name. Minho was not a man who wasted energy on cruelty. He was a man who understood that the most durable kind of consequence was the kind that left no visible mark. There was one additional instruction. He had given it last after a brief pause, in a tone slightly different from the others, less operational, more deliberate. "Find out what she needs," he had said, "not what she asks for. What she actually needs, and make sure she has it." In the week that followed Emily's discharge, things appeared in her life without explanation. The Airbnb she had booked, small, near the hospital for monitoring appointments, the only one in her budget, turned out to have been upgraded. Same booking reference, different apartment. Clean, warm on the 4th floor, with a kitchen window that looked over a courtyard garden and a bathroom with a tub deep enough to be useful at 7 months pregnant. No explanation from the platform, no charge difference on her card. Her monitoring appointments were redirected to a private clinic, Dr. Song Ji-yoon, one of the top maternal fetal specialists in Seoul, a prepaid account. Emily had stood at the reception desk and asked to whom she should direct her billing questions, and the receptionist had smiled and said, "It's already handled, Ms. Johnson." "By who? The account is under the name Kang." Emily had stood very still. Then she had said, "I see," in the voice she used when she was processing something she hadn't decided what to do with yet. She went home, to the upgraded Airbnb that was not hers and she sat in the kitchen window with both hands wrapped around a cup of water, and she thought about the tea that had appeared in the hospital, and the blanket, and the man who had sat in a corridor chair for 4 hours and then, apparently, rearranged several of the structural circumstances of her life while she slept. She thought about this for a long time. Then she called the number she had for him, an old number from Lagos, still in her phone under M, because she had never given him a name in her contacts and had not been able to decide what name to give him. He answered on the second ring. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I know, in person." A pause. Yes, they met at a small tea house on a street she didn't know in a neighborhood that felt specifically chosen for the absence of surveillance cameras, which she clocked immediately because she had grown up in London and had spent 3 years in Seoul, and she had learned to read a city's infrastructure the way other people read maps. He was already there when she arrived. Different jacket, same quality of stillness. He had ordered tea, the same kind he'd left for her in the hospital, she realized, and filed that away. She sat across from him. She looked at him the way she rarely let herself look at people, directly without managing the impression it created. "You've been watching me for 8 months, she said. "Yes, without my knowledge. Yes, that's a violation." "Yes," he said, not defensive, not apologetic, just, "Yes, it is, and I did it anyway." She appreciated the honesty more than she would have expected to. She was used to men who qualified everything. "Why didn't you just tell me?" "I knew about the marriage. I knew what it was. Because the marriage is a liability to you, and the less you knew about my activities, the safer you were." He looked at his tea. The situation was more complicated than I explained at the time. There are people who know your name is attached to mine, not many. But enough to make your safety a responsibility. I didn't give you the option of declining. She absorbed this. "So I've been under protection I didn't agree to." "Yes. And now that the hospital happened, visibility changed," Minho said. "He made a scene in a public corridor. People heard your name, your situation." He met her eyes. "My people heard it before I did." She felt the weight of that, the infrastructure of it, the network of eyes and ears she had been moving through for 8 months without knowing, like water moving through a system it can't see. "Are you going to keep doing this?" she asked, arranging things without asking. He was quiet for a moment. "I would rather ask than ask." Another pause. "The clinic, the apartment, those were already done. I won't take them back. But anything going forward." He stopped. This was, she would later understand, a significant thing. Minho stopping mid-sentence because he hadn't finished knowing what he meant to say. "Going forward," she prompted. "I want to be present," he said, "not hovering, not managing, just available." He looked out the window. "You are carrying my name, even if you don't use it." And what happened in that corridor, what he said, his jaw tightened, 1 millimeter. She caught it. "He's not worth your energy," she said. "I know." A pause. "I've already spent it." She looked at him. "What did you do?" "Nothing that can be traced. Nothing that required. Nothing you need to disclaim." She thought about Kevin's face the last time she'd seen it. The absolute certainty of a man who believed he was leaving a situation without consequences. She thought about her baby, moving under her hand. "I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry," she said finally. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, the structural possibility of one. "No," he said, "I didn't think you would be." They sat in the tea house for another hour. He told her things, not everything, not the parts that would have been dangerous for her to carry, but the shape of it, the network, the reach, the reason her name in his records had mattered to certain people. She asked the right questions. He answered them straight, which she suspected was not something he did often with people. When she left, he stood. Not performing courtesy, it was automatic, and she thought that said something about how he had been raised, which was not a thing she had thought about before, and which she filed away carefully. On the street she turned back once. He was still at the table, not watching her leave, looking at his tea. Carrying something. She didn't know what, but it was there. She walked to the subway. She put her hand on her side. "We're okay," she told the baby. "I think we might be okay." Over the following 3 weeks, a new shape took form around her life. It was not romance. She was clear about that with herself. She had learned at some cost the danger of mistaking kindness for something more architectured, and Minho's kindness, when it came, was the kind that kept its distance. He appeared at her monitoring appointments, not inside, not even at the entrance, but in the car park 2 buildings down, visible if she happened to look. A car she hadn't ordered materialized on days when her appointments ran late. Her refrigerator never emptied at the pace it should have, given that she hadn't shopped for the things that kept appearing in it. She mentioned the refrigerator one evening over the phone. They had begun to talk in the evenings, briefly, exchanging practical information that occasionally revealed more than practical information. "Someone has access to my apartment," she said. A beat. "Yes, that's also a violation. It's also your dinner." She closed her eyes. She was furious and trying not to be, which was its own category of difficulty. Minho, yes, you can't just. She stopped, started again. I am not someone who needs to be managed. I've been managing myself since I was 17 years old, across 2 countries, and I know how to. I know you do, he said, quietly, not interrupting. Completing, she stopped. I know you know how to manage yourself, he said. I've watched you do it for 8 months. I'm not doing this because I think you can't. I'm doing it because. He stopped. That pause again. The one where he ran out of prepared language. Because why, she said. Silence, the expensive kind. Because I can, he said finally. And because nobody should have to do all of it alone. She sat very still in her kitchen. Her baby moved. The fridge thing stops, she said. Agreed. And you tell me before you arrange anything, agreed. And she paused. The monitoring appointments. Can you come inside next time instead of sitting in the car park? Just come inside. A long pause, as if he was checking whether this was real. Yes, he said. He came inside, doctor. Song Ji-yoon, who had seen many things in her years of practice, took one look at Minho standing against the wall of the consultation room with his hands clasped in front of him and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of someone who was, in fact, deeply invested in every word being spoken. And she addressed him as father, without a single moment's hesitation. Minho did not correct her. Emily, lying on the examination table with the monitor pressed to her side, watched him watching the screen when the heartbeat came through. That fast, determined drumming that always made her throat close, and she watched his face do something it probably didn't do very often. He went very still, the particular stillness of something being felt all the way through. He noticed her watching. He looked away, but she had seen it. And the seeing of it changed something in the room that neither of them commented on, which was how the most important changes always happened. It was 3 days after that appointment that the first sign of real trouble came. Minho called at 11 in the morning, earlier than their usual time, which was enough to tell her something was wrong. I need you to move, he said. Move where? There's an apartment in Yongsan. Secure building. You'll have. Minho. She kept her voice level. What happened? A pause. There's been surveillance on your current address. Not mine, targeted at you. Someone knows about the marriage. She sat down. Someone from your side or, I don't know yet. His voice was clipped in the specific way of someone managing information under pressure. It could be from Lagos. There was a faction that lost something when that situation was resolved. They've been dormant, but now they know my name. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. She looked at her window, the courtyard garden she'd started to love, the light in the afternoons. She thought about what it meant to have this pulled away. She thought about how quickly she'd started to trust the shape of this life. She thought about her baby. How long do I have to pack, she said. He exhaled, not audibly, but she felt it through the phone, like something releasing. An hour. I'll have someone come to. I'll pack myself, she said. Have the car there in an hour. The Yongsan apartment was different from the Airbnb in the way that a fortress is different from a house. Beautiful. Minho had taste, or someone who arranged things for him had taste, but the windows had specific glass, the door had 2 locks she hadn't seen before, and the man who met her downstairs introduced himself as June and did not explain what June did, but had the particular stillness of someone who had learned it from Minho. Minho arrived that evening. He stood in the doorway of the apartment, her apartment, his arrangement, and he looked at how she'd already placed things, her books by the window. Her work materials on the kitchen table, laptop open, post-its in the margins of the papers. A small plant she'd bought because she'd needed something alive. You unpacked fast, he said. I've moved a lot, she said. You get efficient. He came inside. He looked at the plant. He looked at her books, not intrusively, just noting them the way he noted everything, cataloging, filing. Do you know who they are? She asked. The people watching. I have a suspicion. He sat down. Not at the table, at the far end of the couch, leaving space. There's a man named Dae-jung. He was peripheral to what happened in Lagos. He lost a significant financial interest when that situation resolved. He spent the better part of a year trying to locate leverage against me. Minho looked at his hands. I didn't think he'd look sideways at a civilian connection. I miscalculated. You're saying this is your fault. I'm saying it's my responsibility. The difference between those two things was something she understood instinctively. She had grown up with a mother who took responsibility for everything without assigning herself blame, and she recognized the architecture of it in someone else. What does he want? She asked. Pressure, information, something he can use to back me into a position where I make a decision that benefits him. Minho's voice was even. He doesn't know you well enough to know that approaching you is not a good strategy. Meaning? A pause. And then, in a tone that was not quite a compliment but was adjacent to one, meaning you are not the kind of person who folds under pressure. Which he will learn, she looked at him. You say that like you know. I watched you in that corridor, he said. I have watched you for 8 months. I know. The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul moved and lit and hummed. She thought about asking what else he knew, and she thought better of it because she was not ready for the answer. How do we handle Dae-jung? She asked instead. Minho almost smiled. You said responsibility. That goes both directions. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, a recalibration like a man revising a conclusion he'd been sure of. There's a meeting, he said, scheduled for next week. Dae-jung wants to negotiate. I wasn't planning to bring you into it. But you are already in it. He met her eyes. I want you to know everything before it happens. No more management. She nodded. Tell me everything he did. It took 2 hours. He spoke with the precision of someone who had organized information carefully over a long period of time. The geography of it, the history, the specific anatomy of what Dae-jung wanted, and what leverage he believed he had, and what he didn't know that would be his undoing. Minho spoke about his world the way very few people spoke about anything, without softening, without performing, without asking her to react in a particular way. She listened without interrupting. She asked 4 questions at the end, all the right ones. Afterward, there was a silence that felt different from the previous silences, denser, shared, like standing in the same rain. My mother doesn't know any of this, she said suddenly. No, she thinks I'm building something stable. A pause. She's coming for the birth in 6 weeks. Minho was quiet. She's going to ask about you, Emily said. Because the name Kang is on my medical records and she's going to. She is very thorough, my mother. What do you want me to tell her? I want you to. She stopped. This was the edge of the territory she'd been avoiding. I don't know what you are to me, she said plainly, outside of paperwork. The sentence sat there. He didn't rush it. No, he said. I don't know either. That's honest. Yes. She looked at her hands. But you came inside the appointment. Yes. And you're sitting in my living room at 9:30 at night. Yes. And the tea in the hospital. Yes. Very quietly. That's not nothing, she said. He met her eyes. No, he said. It's not nothing. They did not say anything else about it that night. She made tea, both of them pretending this was practical rather than deliberate, and he stayed until 11, and when he left, he paused in the doorway for a fraction longer than leaving required, and she noticed, and she let herself notice, which was its own kind of decision. She lay awake afterward with her hand on her side, listening to the city and the baby and the specific quality of the silence he had left behind. She thought about Lagos. About the moment in the hotel lobby when she'd stood beside a man she didn't know and translated sentences with a beating heart and a completely level face, and how he'd looked at her afterward with an expression that even then she hadn't known how to read. She thought about the papers she'd signed, administrative, protective, fictional, and about how fiction, sustained long enough, begins to develop its own infrastructure. She thought about a man sitting in a corridor chair for 4 hours and leaving tea in the dark. She was not going to say she was falling in love with him. She was not going to use that language even inside her own head, because she had used it before, and it had cost her in specific ways that she was still paying for. And she was 7 months pregnant, and her life had just acquired a significant number of complications. And she was not the kind of woman who made decisions with her chest while her head was turned. But she thought about the heartbeat on the monitor and the way his face had gone still, and she thought, that is not a man performing. That is a man who is terrified of how much this matters. Over the following days, the shape between them shifted in ways that could not be measured in any single moment. He called every evening at 8, not always with information. Sometimes just to confirm she was all right, and then gradually to talk about her work, about the logistics project she had taken on because she needed something that was entirely hers, about the books in her window. He listened the way very few people listened, as if each thing she said was being carefully filed rather than merely processed. She asked him about his food preferences one night because she was planning dinner, and the question came out before she'd decided to ask it. And he was quiet for a moment and then said that he hadn't thought about that in years because most of his meals were arranged by other people. She had sat with that answer for a long time. She thought about what it cost to have everything managed for you until you no longer knew what you wanted in your own mouth. She made dinner, and she called him at the last minute and said, "Come over, I want to know what you think." He thought the rice was perfect. He told her so without being asked. There was a night when she had a bad dream, Nothing specific, just the texture of it, the particular dread of being in a room that kept shrinking. And she woke at 3 in the morning with her heart going faster than usual. She picked up her phone. She did not call him. She stared at his number for a long time, and then she put the phone down and she lay there, and she thought about the fact that she wanted to call him and what that meant. In the morning he called first. "You didn't sleep," he said. "How do you know?" A pause. Not quite an answer, which was an answer. "You have to stop having people watch me," she said. "The building has cameras," he said, "for your safety." "Min-ho, the cameras are for your safety," he repeated. A beat. "I happened to check them at 3:15 in the morning because I also wasn't sleeping." She held the phone. "Why weren't you sleeping?" The expensive silence again. "Come for dinner tonight," she said. "I'll make something that takes concentration. You can help." "I don't cook." "You'll cut vegetables. It's not complicated." He cut vegetables. Badly, but with the complete focus of someone who does not do things halfway. She showed him the correct angle twice, and on the third time he got it right, and she said nothing, but she was aware that he noticed her saying nothing, and that noticing meant something to him. They ate on the floor because the table had her work spread across it, and the domesticity of it was so completely unplanned that neither of them commented on it, which was the only way it could exist without shattering. "Tell me about your mother," he said. She looked up from her bowl. "Why?" "Because you mention her carefully," he said. "The way people mention things that matter." She thought about this. Then she talked about Patricia Johnson, who had come from Lagos to London when Emily was 9 with one large bag and an attitude toward hardship that she had never once framed as hardship. About the Sunday calls. About the way her mother laughed, enormous, unself-conscious, filling whatever room it was in. About the warm food that appeared whenever anything went wrong, because her mother had learned somewhere very young that care expressed through action was more honest than care expressed through words. Min-ho listened. She watched him listen. She watched him recognize something. "She sounds like someone important," he said. "She's the most important person I know," Emily said. Then she paused. "She's going to love you or terrify you, possibly both." "I've survived terrifying," he said. "Not like this." Something moved through his face, apprehension and something warmer underneath it. He stayed until midnight. He washed the bowls without being asked, and she watched him do it. A man who ran an empire across 3 countries, standing at her sink doing dishes with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and she thought, "That's it. That's the thing, that right there." He turned and found her watching him. He looked at the dish towel in his hands. He looked at her. "I should go," he said. "Probably," she said. Neither of them moved for about 4 seconds. Then he folded the dish towel and set it on the counter and walked to the door, and she followed because that was what you did, and at the door he stopped and turned, and they were much closer than the space had been suggesting. "Emily," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded, a nod that contained everything they weren't saying yet, and he left. She stood on her side of the door for a long time, she thought. At some point this is going to have to be named, she thought. Not tonight. Tonight it can stay like this, warm and unnamed and completely real. The trouble arrived in a form she had not anticipated. It arrived as a message on her phone, an unknown number, a text with no introduction. "He's not who you think. Ask him about the Yu family." She stared at it for a long time. Then she did something that surprised her. She didn't ask Min-ho about it immediately. She put the phone down and she went to work, and she worked for 4 hours, and she thought about the message in the background the way you think about a sound you can't identify. That evening Min-ho called at the usual time and she answered, and they talked about her appointment earlier that day. All clear, everything measured correctly, 6 weeks out. And she held the message in her mind and listened to his voice and thought about the architecture of trust, how it built, and how it could be dismantled, and which one was happening to her right now. She did not ask about the Yu family. The second message came 2 days later. He had a daughter once. Find out why he doesn't anymore. She sat with this one for a long time. She was still sitting with it when Min-ho knocked. He knocked now instead of just arriving, which was a small change that she had not pointed out but that she noticed. And he came in and looked at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She showed him the messages. He read them. His face did not change in the way that most people's faces would have changed. But he sat down, not on the couch, in the kitchen chair, which was closer, and he put his hands flat on the table. "Daejung," he said. "Is it true?" she asked. "About a daughter," a very long pause. "Yes," he said. She waited. He looked at the wall, then back at her. Her name was Soo-jin. She would be 7 now. His voice was entirely level, and that levelness cost him something she could see the price of. Her mother and I were not. It was a different time in my life. We were not well suited. The arrangement around Sujin's custody was something I negotiated badly. A pause. I made choices that put work above the arrangement, repeatedly. Her mother relocated to the United States 8 months after Sujin was born, and the legal architecture in place at the time, and my own inaction, allowed it. Emily looked at him. I haven't seen her in 4 years, he said. I've tried to reconnect. The legal process has been. He stopped. It has not been simple. She thought about the monitoring appointment, the heartbeat, his face. That's why you came in, she said quietly. He looked at her. The appointment, she said. That's why you weren't just there for me. You were there because both, he said. Both. And then with a rawness that she understood was not something he offered easily. I don't want to be the man who doesn't show up again. The kitchen was completely silent. This was the crack. This was what changed everything, not his power or his reach or the way he moved through a room. This. A man at a kitchen table, carrying a wound that hadn't healed, trying, with everything he had, to be different from the version of himself he was most afraid of. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He went very still. She did not move her hand. Daejung sent those messages to shake you, she said. To make me doubt you, I know, so tell me something he doesn't want me to know. Minho looked at her hand on his. He turned his hand over, slowly, carefully, like handling something he didn't want to damage, and held it. I've been in contact with my lawyers about Sujin every month for the past year, he said. The case was reopened in December. There's a hearing in 8 weeks. 8 weeks, she said. Yes, that's around when. Yes, he said. I know. She looked at him. He was looking at their hands. I would very much like, he said, to introduce my daughter to you at some point. If that's something you... He stopped. He didn't have language for this. She understood that. She understood that what he was doing right now was not performance. It was a man building something in real time, without a blueprint, terrified it wouldn't hold. Yes, she said. I'd like that, he exhaled. They stayed like that, hands on the table, the baby moving, the city outside, for a long time. The crisis broke at the worst possible moment. She was 34 weeks pregnant when June knocked on her door at 6 in the morning, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and said, "You need to come now." She was dressed in 4 minutes. She had learned a long time ago that emergency dressing had to be practiced. Minho was in the building's ground floor office, on the phone, and when she came in, he looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had been hoping not to need her yet. "What is it?" she said. "Daejung's people moved overnight," he said. "They hit 2 of my operations. It's contained, but," he paused, "they also put out a name, your name. In the kind of circles where that creates problems." She sat down. "What kind of problems? People who want to use you as a message to me." He looked at her. "Not here. You're safe in this building. But your colleague, Marcus, the one who was planning the shower, Marcus," she felt cold. "What about him? He's been approached. Politely. With questions about you, your schedule, your habits." Minho's voice was even. "We flagged it this morning. He hasn't said anything he didn't already know." She thought about Marcus, who was 24 and enthusiastic, and had been trying to make her feel at home in Seoul for 3 years, and who had nothing to do with any of this. "He needs to be warned," she said. "My people can. I'll do it," she said. "He needs to hear it from me." Minho looked at her for a moment. Then, "I'll have someone with you." "No. It'll scare him." She met Minho's eyes. "I know how to handle this. Let me do it." He held her gaze. 30 minutes out, 1 check-in call. If you don't call, I'll call," she said. She met Marcus at the coffee shop they always used, and she told him enough, not everything but the shape of the danger, wrapped in language that minimized without lying. And Marcus, to his credit, went very still and said, "Emily, how long has this been happening?" "A while," she said, "and you didn't. I didn't want to pull you into it." He looked at her for a long time. "I need you to know I'm not leaving town or anything dramatic, but I'm going to need you to tell me if this escalates." "I will," she said. "I promise." She called Minho at the 30-minute mark. "Clear," she said. A pause. "Good." And then softer, "Thank you for saying it yourself." She understood what he meant, that she had protected someone she cared about without delegating the care. That mattered to him in a way she was starting to understand. June found it the next morning, embedded in the building's security system. A small device, sophisticated, not amateur work. Someone inside, someone with access for months. Minho received the news and had the source identified by 9, which was how Emily understood the scale of what she was standing next to. Not cruelty, not violence, but efficiency. The kind of efficiency that did not allow for loose threads. The source was a man 3 floors up, hired 6 months ago, which meant before Emily had moved in, which meant the infiltration predated this situation and had been dormant, waiting. Dae-jung was more patient than Min-ho had been accounting for. Min-ho sat in the apartment and explained all of this to Emily with the thoroughness he had promised and the steadiness she had come to expect, and she listened and asked 2 questions and then said, "What do we do?" "We accelerate," Min-ho said. "The meeting I've been avoiding, Dae-jung wants a settlement, he wants something. I've been positioning to deny him, but..." He looked at his hands. "If we accelerate and give him something that satisfies the account while protecting everything that matters, can you do that?" "Yes, but I have to move this week, and I need you to be somewhere specific while I do. Not here, not visible." She understood. "Where?" "Ji-yeon's," he said. "Vancouver." She looked at him. "You're sending me to your sister." "I'm asking," he corrected. "I'm asking if you'll go to my sister." The difference, again, she had started to love the difference. For how long? 10 days. 2 weeks at most. She thought about Marcus, safe. She thought about her mother, 6 weeks away. She thought about 34 weeks and a baby who had their own schedule and did not necessarily care about anyone else's. "I'll go," she said. He exhaled. "Call Jiyeon," she added. "Warn her. She's going to have opinions about all of this." "She already has opinions about all of this," he said. "She's had them for 11 months. That night, after the logistics were arranged and the travel was confirmed and the building had been swept twice, Emily sat alone in the apartment. This was the moment. This was the one she had been circling without landing on. She sat in the kitchen where she'd made her mother's recipe, where she'd held his hand on the table, where she'd watched him wash her bowls with his full attention, and she opened her airline app and she looked at flights to London. She thought about her mother's house, the specific quality of safety that lived there, not the absence of trouble, but the presence of a person who had always been a foundation. She thought about having this baby in a familiar room with a familiar smell, without any of this. Without the infrastructure of dangerous men and private clinic and people whose job title was never explained. She thought about Kevin's face in the corridor, the absolute conviction that she had nobody, and she thought about how almost right he had been. 3 years in Seoul and her true network was a colleague she'd had to warn away from her own situation, and a man she'd technically married as a bureaucratic protection measure. She thought about that man's hands on the table. She thought about how loneliness had been her native climate for so long that she had stopped being able to identify what the alternative felt like, and how, in the last several weeks, she had begun to feel the warmth of the alternative, and how the scariest thing was not the danger surrounding them, but the fact that she wanted this. Not the protection, not the arrangement, him, the way he listened, the way he looked at the monitor, the way he ate her food without performing anything. She was afraid of wanting it. She had wanted things before and had been wrong about them. She had committed herself before and been left holding the wreckage. She was 34 weeks pregnant and tired, and she had enemies she'd inherited from a marriage she'd entered as a favor, and the sensible thing, the self-protecting thing, was to take herself and her baby somewhere safe and rebuild from scratch. Her finger hovered over the search button. She thought about the appointment, the heartbeat on the monitor, the way he had gone completely still, as if the sound had stopped him in the middle of something he'd been running from for years. She thought about a man who cut vegetables badly and washed dishes without being asked and paused too long in doorways because leaving was not what he wanted to do. She thought about a daughter named Sujin who would be 7 now, about a hearing in 8 weeks, about a man trying, visibly, at cost, imperfectly, not to be the person he'd been. She closed the airline app. She put the phone down. She sat for a very long time in the quiet kitchen, and she let herself feel the full weight of the choice, not just what she was choosing, but what she was refusing to choose, and what that refusal cost her. And when she had felt it completely, she stood up, put the kettle on, and called Min-ho. He answered, in one ring. "I thought about leaving," she said. A pause. "I'm not leaving," she said. Another pause. When he spoke, his voice was different. Not different in a way she could have described to someone who hadn't been listening for weeks. Just different. "Okay," he said. "But I need you to understand that I'm choosing this," she said. "Not because I'm afraid to leave, because I'm choosing to stay. There's a difference." "I know the difference," he said. "Good. A beat. The kettle's on. Come over." He came over. He sat in the kitchen chair and she put tea in front of him, and they did not discuss what she had just told him except in the ways they discussed it without words. His hand on the table in the space between them, her eventually touching it, and him turning it over again. Outside, Sol was being Sol, indifferent and luminous. The baby moved. 6 weeks, he said. About that. Your mother, she's going to have questions. I'll answer them, he said, honestly. Whatever she needs to know. She looked at him. She's going to want to know what you are to me. He met her eyes. What am I? She thought about it. She thought about Lagos and the papers and the tea and the appointments and the dinner and the hands and the daughter named Sujin who would be 7 now, and the man sitting in a corridor chair for 4 hours because he couldn't not be there. Necessary, she said. Something moved through his face. He looked down. That might be the best thing anyone said to me, he said. Don't make it weird, she said. He almost smiled. More than almost. This is the moment. If you've been holding your breath, if you're sitting somewhere you should have left 20 minutes ago, that's exactly where you should be. Like this video if you haven't already. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Ji-yeon Kang was a surprise. She was 30 years old, and where Min-ho was all contained surfaces, she was all expressed interior. She opened the door of her Vancouver apartment before Emily had finished knocking and said, in English, "You're exactly what I thought, and I mean that entirely as a compliment," and ushered her inside without pausing. The apartment smelled like coffee and books. Ji-yeon made tea without asking, put it in front of Emily, sat across from her and said, "Tell me everything he hasn't told you." Emily laughed, genuinely fully, the laugh she usually only had in Yoruba. It surprised her. "Your brother is very thorough," she said. "My brother is thorough about everything except himself," Ji-yeon said. "I've been trying to translate him for 30 years. You've had 8 months. Between us we might have the full picture." They stayed up until midnight. Ji-yeon talked about Min-ho in the way that only siblings talk about each other, with love sharp enough to cut glass. She talked about what he was like before the work consumed everything, and what she'd watched the work take from him, and the way Sujin's situation had broken something in him that hadn't fully healed, and how Emily was. Ji-yeon paused here, looking for language, the first person in a long time who he had chosen toward rather than managed. "Chosen toward," Emily said. "He manages everyone else," Ji-yeon said. "Takes care of, protects, arranges. You, he chose toward you. He wanted to be somewhere." "That's different." Emily thought about this. She thought about it the next morning and the morning after that, while Ji-yeon made food and asked careful questions about the baby, and showed Emily pictures of Sujin at 3 years old, small and bright-eyed with Min-ho's particular stillness already forming in her face. On the 4th day, Min-ho called. "It's almost done," he said. "How done is almost?" Dae-jung accepted the framework. There are conditions on both sides. It holds as long as neither party has reason to escalate. A pause. "The hearing for Sujin is in 4 days. Her heart moved. "Min-ho, I know. Are you? I don't know." A pause. "I haven't slept." She had known he hadn't slept. She had been able to hear it in the quality of his pauses for 3 days. "Listen to me," she said. "You are not the same person you were 4 years ago." Silence. "You've been building toward this for a year. You show up. You showed up for Sujin in every way you could within what the system allowed, and now you're going to show up in that room. A beat. You understand?" "Yes." Very quiet. "Tell me you believe it." A long pause. "Then I'm working on it." "Good enough," she said. The day of the hearing she called him at 7 in the morning. He was already at the courthouse. She told him she would be on the phone the entire time if he needed it. He said that wasn't necessary. She said she'd be on the phone the entire time if he needed it. He said, "Thank you." She sat in Ji-yeon's apartment and watched Vancouver be gray and coastal outside, and she held her phone and her baby moved steadily under her hand, and Ji-yeon brought tea and sat beside her without asking, and they waited. He called at 2 in the afternoon. He said her name, and in the way he said it, she heard everything. "Tell me," she said. "Supervised visitation," he said. "Monthly, with a review in 6 months. It's not full custody, not yet, but it's, I can see her, I can." His voice broke fractionally, the smallest hairline fracture in the most controlled voice she had ever known. "I'm going to see her next weekend." Emily pressed her hand to her side. The baby moved. She closed her eyes. "There it is," she said. "Yes," he said. "There it is." Ji-yeon beside her asked nothing. Just handed her a tissue which Emily looked at and then put down because she was not going to cry, and then she picked it back up because she was in fact going to cry, and she was 34 weeks pregnant and she had earned it. She flew back to Seoul 3 days later. He met her at the airport, not through a driver himself. Standing outside arrivals in a gray jacket and dark shirt, the way he always looked, the way she would have recognized at any distance in any room on any continent. She walked to him. She stopped. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. They stood in the arrivals hall with people moving around them in every direction, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the tea house. That first time, direct, uncalculated, and she thought about what Ji-yeon had said. Chosen toward, she reached up and put her hand flat against his chest the way she'd put her hand over his on the table. He went still. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm. "You're going to meet my mother," she said. "Yes, she will ask difficult questions. I know. And in 6 weeks there's going to be a lot of change. I know." His hand came up and covered hers on his chest and held it there, not tight. "Just present, Emily, yes. I've been trying to find language for this for 8 months, he said. "Take your time," she said. He looked up, met her eyes. "I don't want to manage this anymore," he said. "I don't want to arrange things from a distance and watch and keep the correct amount of space." A pause. I know what you want," she said. "Do you?" "Same thing I want," she said, which I've been not saying for about 3 weeks. His thumb moved over her hand, the smallest gesture, the one that cost him nothing and everything. "So say it," he said. She held it for one more moment, the last moment before the thing was named and therefore real and therefore possible to lose. And then she said, "You're not management material, Minho. You never were. You were always just you, and that's enough for me. That's everything." He looked at her. He brought her hand from his chest and held it in both of his. His forehead came down to rest against hers, gentle, brief, the most careful thing she had ever felt. And they stood like that in the middle of the arrivals hall with Seoul pressing in around them, and her baby moved between them, and something that had been building for 8 months arrived at its natural destination. He kissed her forehead, slowly, deliberately. Like a promise made in a language that needed no translation, she let him. Then she pulled back and said, "Now take me home. My back is killing me and I need that jollof." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it sounded like something returning from a very long way away. And she thought, there it is. There's the version of you that's been waiting. Patricia Johnson arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of Emily's 38th week. She came through arrivals pulling one large bag and wearing an expression that Emily had known her entire life. The expression of a woman who had already formed several conclusions and was waiting for the evidence to catch up. She took one look at Emily, one look at the apartment, one look at the very careful distance Minho was maintaining from the kitchen doorway. Then she looked at Emily and said, in Yoruba, "This one stayed, he stayed," Emily said. Patricia put down her bag. She walked to Minho. She looked at him for a long moment, the full, frank assessment of a woman who had built a life through her own judgment of people, and had never once been wrong about what mattered. She said, in English, "You were there in the hospital. My daughter didn't tell me, but I know." "Yes," he said, and after, "Yes." "And you're the one who's been." "Yes," he said. All of it, Patricia nodded once, the same nod Emily made when she had received information she would now file permanently. "Dinner," Patricia said, walking to the kitchen and beginning to open cupboards. "We're making dinner. Tell me what you have." Minho, who had stood in rooms with some of the most dangerous men in Asia and not moved a muscle, looked briefly, completely off balance. Emily from the couch said, "Just answer her questions. She already knows everything anyway." He answered her questions. They ate dinner. Patricia talked about Lagos, about Emily as a child. Stubborn at 3 years old, the way she'd learned to walk by refusing help, the way she'd always placed her hand on her side when she was thinking hard, a gesture she'd had since she was small. Minho listened with the full, focused attention he brought to everything that mattered. Afterward, when Emily had gone to rest, Patricia sat at the kitchen table and looked at Minho's and said quietly, "She's been alone for a long time in the way that matters." "I know," he said. "Don't let her be alone in that way again." "No," he said, "not a promise, a fact. I won't." Patricia looked at him one more time with the full weight of her assessment. Then she nodded. The baby arrived at 4 in the morning on a Wednesday, 3 days after Patricia's arrival, which felt correct. Early on her own schedule, refusing to be predicted, Minho was in the waiting room. Not across the hall, not in the car park, not at the end of a phone. In the waiting room of the same hospital, in a chair that was not the one from 8 months ago, but might as well have been. And Patricia sat beside him and did not ask him to leave. When the nurse opened the door at 7:18 in the morning and said, "Mr. Kang?" he stood immediately, as if he had been ready for hours, which he had been, which everyone in the room understood. Emily was sitting up in the bed. She was tired in the specific, settled way of someone who had done a hard thing and done it completely. And in her arms was a small, entirely certain person who had arrived with the same no-nonsense efficiency her mother had always had. He walked in. He stopped at the side of the bed. She looked up at him. "She," Emily said. "A girl." He looked at the baby. He looked at Emily. And his face, that carefully maintained architecture of control and distance, simply gave way, not collapsed, gave way. The way a window gives way to morning light, all at once and completely. He sat on the edge of the bed because he didn't trust himself to stand. Emily shifted and placed the baby in his arms. He took her the way you take something irreplaceable, with both hands, with total attention, with the absolute conviction that you are not going to let anything happen to this. The baby opened her eyes. "Hello," he said, quietly, in Korean and then in English and then in neither, just a sound, a breath, the language that needs no translation. Patricia, in the doorway, looked at her daughter, and her daughter looked back at her, and between them passed the specific knowledge of women who have watched men arrive at the understanding that love is not a performance. He stayed all day. He held the baby when Emily slept, and he sat in the chair, and he did not check his phone. Patricia brought food that Min-ho ate without being asked twice, and at one point she handed him a cup of tea without a word. And he took it, and she said, "My daughter's tea is better." And he said, "Yes." "I know," and she almost smiled. Emily woke in the late afternoon to find Min-ho in the chair with the baby asleep on his chest, his hands spanning her back entirely, his face turned toward Emily's bed, watching her sleep. When he saw she was awake, he said immediately, "How do you feel?" "Like I did something significant," she said. "You did." She looked at her daughter, at him. "She needs a name," she said. "I know. I was thinking." She paused. "Mina." "It works in both languages." He looked at the baby. At the name landing on her, "Mina," he said, the baby made a small, considered sound. "She agrees," Emily said. The corridor outside was the same one. She had not chosen this room consciously, or maybe she had, and she was not always honest with herself about the things she chose consciously. The same long hallway, the same nurse's station, the same institutional light. But tonight, Min-ho was here, not across the hall, not folding a newspaper, here in the room in the chair with Mina asleep on his chest and his eyes open in the dark. Emily lay back against the pillows. She thought about a wheelchair and a corridor wall and a woman who had looked at her own hands and made a decision about whether to feel things or file them away. She thought about all the things she had filed and all the things she had eventually let herself feel, and the specific cost and value of both. She thought about a man who had chosen toward her for 11 months without the vocabulary to name it, and about a girl named Soo-jin who would come to this city in a few weeks and meet her father and meet something she didn't have a word for yet, and about how families were not made from perfection but from presence, repeated over time. "Min-ho," she said quietly. "Yes, you were watching me for 8 months. Yes, that was a long time to watch without saying anything. Yes, don't do that again." A pause. "No," he said. "I won't." She closed her eyes. "You should sleep," he said. "I know." She didn't move. "Stay." "Yes," he said. "I'm staying outside." Soul carried on, indifferent, luminous, enormous. And inside the room, a man sat in a chair with a small certain girl asleep on his chest, and a woman who had survived everything that had been meant to break her resting in the bed 3 feet away. And the 4 in the morning quiet held all of them with the particular gentleness of things that have finally, after a very long journey, arrived. Mina breathed, Min-ho breathed, Emily breathed, and something that had been alone for a very long time was not alone anymore. If you made it to the end of this story, if you stayed through the hospital corridor and the tea house and the kitchen and the arrivals hall and all the quiet spaces in between, then you already know this story wasn't just about a man watching from across the hall. It was about a woman who refused to be reduced by anyone, and a man who learned that proximity is not protection, and that showing up, really showing up, is the hardest and only thing that counts. Like this video, leave a comment and tell us what moment hit different for you. Subscribe so you never miss a story, because there are more coming, and every single one of them begins with someone choosing, in the quiet, to stay.